I am Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, but obviously recording from home tonight. And actually, I'm very happy on this very frigid evening. That's got to get a lot colder to be already cozy at home. Though we do truly miss everybody coming into the bookstore. We are not open for browsing until the numbers are much more strongly going in the right direction and or we get our shots, which are coming. And even though we're not open for browsing, we're more than happy to work with you, take orders by phone or email or via our website, which we've just upgraded a little bit. And I have to say, it's been really interesting being everyone's personal shopper, sort of long distance, socially distant personal shopping. It's been challenging, but it's been really fun. And we've learned a lot about you all and also about the store and what we offer. So tonight, thank you all for joining us. We're asking everyone to keep their video off and their audio mute so it's not to be distracting. That said, we recommend that you choose the speaker option on your screen. It's different in different places, but that way the speaker will be big and the audience will basically disappear off the screen. And then you can turn on your chat option, which is a button usually at the lower corner of the screen. And there you'll see links to the books and you can add your questions and comments as we go along. We will be recording this event and we post it to our website and CATV will be showing it. I'm not sure when they'll show it, but we will be recording it. And the format is pretty basic. I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll have the presentation and then we invite you to share your questions via the chat and I will jump in and share them with the speaker. So we are very pleased to be launching Melanie Finn's new novel, The Hare. We've celebrated the publication of other books, but I think this is the first actual launch because the book just went on sale on Tuesday. So this is very exciting. Melanie was born in Kenya and moved to Connecticut at the age of 12 when her mother remarried. And by the way, her mother has been very instrumental in having Melanie speak with the bookstore, and we thoroughly enjoy working with her. Melanie attended New York University and graduated with a BA in journalism. Following that, she worked as a freelance journalist in Asia, Austria, US, and Africa. And she wrote about a wide variety of subjects, very wide variety of subjects, including the Grateful Dead, child soldiers, and scuba diving. While she was in Tanzania, she met her husband, the wildlife filmmaker, Matt Eberhard. Am I pronouncing that right? And they made a highly acclaimed Nature Disney feature film, you may know, The Crimson Wing, Mystery of Flamingos. Melanie's first novel, which is sadly unavailable, hopefully it will be brought back into print, Away From You, was longlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction and the IMPAC Award. This was followed by The Gloaming, which some of you know as The Shame, because that was the UK title, which is a haunting novel of guilt, atonement, and hope. And The Underneath was published in 2018, and it explores the struggles of motherhood in an isolated region. The Hare, officially released on Tuesday, as I said. About it, one reviewer wrote, "It's smart and atmospheric, It's smart and atmospheric with the pull of a literary thriller, but with meat and heart," which I thought was a great way of summing up the storyline. So without further ado, oh, and for those of you who have read the book, if you could make sure your chat questions and comments don't put any spoilers in there. Those of us who haven't finished it would appreciate that. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Melanie.
Thank you, Liza, for that incredible introduction. It's always odd hearing people talk about you, like, wow, God, she's really impressive. And, you know, yeah, I've just come from yelling at my kids to put their stuff away. So there's always this grounding. And I feel really, I almost wanted to cry when I saw how many people had shown up this evening. It's really touching. Thank you so much. I didn't expect it. And it's really wonderful that you've come out tonight. I know it's a crazy time, 7 in the evening. It's difficult for a lot of people. And yes, Liza, I want to really thank my mom, who is the band leader and the band when it comes to supporting me. I think that is much more important than maybe she really recognizes, just having that constant and unflagging support at my back. It's really wonderful. And the other thing is I have to thank my brilliant publisher, Eric Obanoff, who's on tonight as well, for this beautiful cover that he created, which comes in the dead of winter. And most of us, I think, just instinctively reach for this beautiful, bright, jewel-like piece of art as it comes into our lives. So he did such a beautiful job. And he's just the most wonderful publisher to work with. So I feel really, really lucky. I'll just give a quick précis of the hair. It's the story of a young woman called Rosie, who is very naive and damaged. She escapes from her oppressive grandmother in the suburbs of Boston, winning an art scholarship to Parsons in New York. And when she's there, she meets an older man, he's 20 years older than her, who's very sophisticated and kind of brings her into his world, which includes the summer at a boathouse on a huge estate on Connecticut's Gold Coast. Bennett is initially a very charming character, particularly to Rosie. So we see the book very much from her perspective, even though as the reader, we're kind of able to guess ahead of time that Bennett is really kind of a jerk and a scoundrel and maybe worse. But from Rosie's perspective, he just seems wonderful and amazing, and he knows everything. He knows about books, he knows about art, and he knows all these amazing famous people. He's hung out with Truman Capote. So she's very much in his sway. Things begin to go wrong, and they have to basically escape in the middle of the night. And then he pitches them up in this farmhouse in the Northeast Kingdom, and basically abandons Rosie and their young daughter Miranda for a job that he may or may not have as a teacher in an elite liberal arts college. Rosie doesn't know how to work a wood stove. She has no money. So for her, surviving really becomes a full-time occupation. And eventually she realizes bit by bit that Bennett is a bad hombre. And that's the first 2/3 of the book. And then the latter third picks up when Rosie is in middle age, and a lot of the consequences of her younger life resurface. So I've chosen 3 separate readings that both kind of reflect Rosie when she's first in the full sway of Bennett in Southport, and then slightly later on when she's in Vermont, and then again when she's actually in middle age and the book picks up again. So in the first section that I'm going to read, Rosie gets pregnant, and I don't think it's a spoiler alert here because of course I have to read something from the book. Rosie gets pregnant. It's an accident, and she decides that she's going to get an abortion. But instead of getting the abortion, she gives all the money that she's been given for the abortion away. And she then realizes that she has no way to get back home from the abortion clinic. So she has to walk, and it's about a 20-mile walk. So we pick up Rosie. She's probably been walking for 4 or 5 hours now. Fairfield Avenue melded with the post road, and Rosie paused in the shade of a hardware store. Her foot throbbed, her head throbbed. She might have a miscarriage from the walking and the heat, and what would that be like? Warm, lumpy blood and relief that the decision had been made for her. For a few minutes, she watched customers coming in and out of the store, mostly men in work clothes. They didn't seem to notice her, intent on pine cabinets and plumbing. They had pencils tucked behind their ears. Their sense of purpose amplified her lack of it, and she felt again her vagueness and transparency. Hobie had said, "a girl like you," and she'd assumed he meant poor, but perhaps he meant insubstantial. He hadn't flirted with her. He'd summoned her and dismissed her like a disappointing employee. The money, just quickly, Hobie is this witch guy who gave her money to go and get an abortion. The money was nothing to him, bits of paper to him, and yet it was life or death for the unborn child within her. It was her entire future. She could phone Ida. It would have to be a collect call, and how would that go? Ida's her art teacher. Would Ida be excited and tell her to keep the baby and come to live with her in New York, and she'd be a grumpy but loving godmother, and the baby would play on the floor as Rosie and Ida painted? No. Ida would wonder why a student, one of hundreds, was asking for advice on getting an abortion. Rosie thus continued on, miles in the Saharan heat. Then she turned onto Station Street, down Rose Hill, carried on to the bridge over the river, and up Sasko Hill. Despite the low light of the evening, the heat stubbornly remained. Her shoulders sagged. She could not effect an effortless stroll. She trudged. She felt dizzy and unsteady and sticky with sweat. She looked at the golden sea and thought of Bruegel's Icarus and the relentless forward motion of life. With every second, the summer was closer to being over. Reaching the country club, she decided to take a shortcut past the clubhouse along the shore. As she turned down the club's drive, she saw a dead squirrel, its lower body completely flattened, but the upper portion and the head intact. The death had just happened, for the blood was bright, and the squirrel still retained a look of surprise. Maybe she'd even seen it alive in the morning. Rosie hurried past, but then she stopped. She turned and bent down. The perfection of the animal she noted, the clean fur, the eager eyes and nimble hands, and the exploded pink sachet of its stomach, the mutilated spine and legs, the absolute fact of what a car does to a body, the frailty of skin and bone and form. Rosie thought about the carpet on the road, the night now months ago, and tart bile rose in her throat. So again, just a quick break. In the very beginning of the book, Bennett runs over something in the middle of the road and ignores it. And Rosie's been haunted by the question of what it was. And she obviously thinks it's a body and not an old carpet, but she's sort of in denial about it. The driveway descended, parting the cartoon-shaped greens, and slithered towards the white clubhouse and the glittering gold sea. She began to run, either away from the dead squirrel or towards the boathouse, or both. Her breasts bounced painfully. She hadn't worn a bra, and they were bigger with the pregnancy, and her right shoe came off. She veered from the tarmac onto the links, directly towards the boathouse. She was stumbling. Her eyes were open, though her vision was hazy, the dark grass, the yellow sea, and she was in the car with Bennett all over again. Her memory had not reshaped the object in the road. The motion of the car had not altered. Bennett had run over a man, maybe a woman, maybe already dead, maybe drunk, a tramp, a lost child, a woman, and Bennett had not stopped, and she had not insisted. She'd listened to Ricky Don't Lose That Number. She had sipped wine, rolled a joint. She'd wished there really had been a party with Mick and Keith. Golfers watched her as she ran. She heard vague shouts, protests, but she kept running. She had to call the police and explain. They would understand. She was very sorry. It was an accident, an oversight, a dark road, an easy mistake to make. Tripping into a bunker, she collapsed in the sand. She was filled with wishing like a runner needing breath at the last mile, wishing so hard, so hard that her guts hurt, wishing that it wasn't true, even praying to either no God at all or a God who certainly wouldn't be sympathetic, praying that it hadn't happened. Hadn't happened, surely had not happened, not the carpet, not the baby. This wasn't supposed to be life, not what she'd fled Lowell for, not how it was for the lesbians who were probably at a party on Fire Island or rehearsing for their new performance. Rosie gritted her teeth and sucked in, wishing somehow time would scroll back. She dreamed, imagined, deluded. Maybe a really bad person had been in the road, a wife beater, a child molester. Maybe someone already dead. Maybe, hey, are you okay? A man in an outfit of circus colours stood above her, golf clubs flung across his shoulder. Do you need help? She could tell right now. She could tell him right now. She could say, call the police. I've killed a man. She would be brave, not pusillanimous. The golfer extended his hand. Another man was behind him. Rosie thought she heard him say, is she on drugs? Rosie stood of her own accord. Sand fell off her. She could feel the grains rubbing into the blisters of her toes and her heel, and she was glad of the gritty pain. This is private property, the clowny one told her. The other one said something about calling the police, and Rosie almost laughed, or perhaps she did, because the two men stepped back as she rose up. They were unsure. She wasn't what they expected out here golfing on a summer evening, yet she rose. Rosie rose, a shabby Botticelli's Venus. She shook the sand, shook her long, loose, sweaty, clumpy hair, and she stumbled away from them. They snickered in her wake. So now we move forward to Rosie trying to settle in and figure things out in the Northeast Kingdom. And as we all know, when we move here, unless we've grown up here, we have to learn how to work a wood stove. And not just the wood stove, but we need to understand about wood. You'll be needing firewood. The man had knocked at the door. He did not introduce himself in his odd, high voice. He was short and broad and dirty. An insect odor hummed about him that Rosie recognized as unwashed flesh. He had a massive tumor in his left cheek and no teeth at all. I don't know, Rosie replied, trying not to fixate on the tumor or the smell. Bennett had left for the college wearing his Harris tweed jacket, so nervous he packed an extra deodorant in his briefcase. You're leaving before the winter then? I think we're planning to be here. That right, the man chewed, looking thoughtful. Will it be very cold? Rosie asked. Reckon we'll know come April. It was perhaps a joke, but the man didn't smile, so Rosie pressed her lips together. You're going through the winter without heat then? He chewed some more, then deftly moved the tumor to the other cheek, and Rosie realized it was tobacco. I'm sure there's heat. Must be some kind of special heat they got down there in the flatlands. This insect man, dark hair as a beetle, tipped his hat and walked back towards his pickup. Wait, she stepped out after him. Do you have a number? I'll have to find out. No phone. You ain't got a phone either. Then how will I? I'm your neighbor, that shithole with the hounds. Yes, Rosie recalled it, a jumble of a place almost eclipsed by brambles. She made a little goodbye wave. The man tipped his hat. His pickup crabbed away down the road, the entire back end of the vehicle moving at a 45-degree angle to the cab. Back inside the house, she regarded the wrought iron stove. Sitting sturdy and spinster-like in the corner of the living room, there were two latches, one on top and one on the front. These accessed the inside of the stove, which was scrupulously clean, just a trace of ash on her fingertip. A lever on the outside worked to close or open a small latch near the stove's chimney pipe. At the bottom was a drawer to collect ash that fell through the grate. Skipping a tiny bit here. The next day, Rosie walked with Miranda in the backpack to the Beetleman's house. The drive was rutted and brutal, terminating in a muddy opening among the brambles. Within this bristly thicket, she could see uneven stacks of logs, piles of scrap wood, rusted machines with arms and jaws, at least 6 dogs on chains, snowmobiles of dubious functionality, a count of 4 cars that clearly were not going anywhere. A 7th dog lived in one. The house was encased in part by flapping plastic. She squelched forward, charting her way through the dogs. They leaned out at her, their full weight against their chains, snarling and bouncing. One was almost suicidal with rage, leaping at her with such enthusiasm that the chain snapped it back, choking its bark. Closer to the house, she called out, "Hello?" Her voice sounded foolish, girly, as if she was selling cookies. The door swung open. The man stumbled down to her. From 10 feet, he stank of sweat and booze. The stench intensified, so that by the time he stood before her, Rosie had the taste in her mouth of rancid butter. "You want the wood, then?" "Yes!" The mud was seeping into her sandals, oozing between her toes. She was shouting over the dark, barking dogs. "How many cards?" "What?" Cards, how many you want? The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a handgun. Rosie shrank back as he raised it skyward and fired. Miranda jolted with surprise and let out a brief wail. With a whimpering transition, the dogs silenced. They're eager to be getting in the woods is all. He put the gun away. Hunting. Hunting? Bear. Bear? Bear? Do people hunt bear? Maybe he wanted to frighten her. She was soft as a kitten. What is a cad? 8 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot of wood. She offered him the 20. He squinted at it. Then, in practice sequence, put the gun away, pulled out his tobacco, stuffed a wadge in his mouth. Seems optimistic. You've got no insulation in that old stove, make more creosote than heat. Rosie did not know about creosote. We'll be all right, she said. Was he smoking, she wondered, or just chewing? He took the money. I don't stack. She turned to face the gauntlet of dogs. Why don't your husband drive you? The dogs were howling now, thrusting against their chains. One weak link, she thought, but she kept her gaze steady and shouted, I like to walk. So then moving forward to 2019, Rose regarded herself. She needed to know what she looked like, if only this once. She believed that a person, a woman of 54, should be acquainted with her naked physical self. And so here in the changing room of J.C. Penney, with its merciless prison break lighting, here and now, was as good a place as any. This is what she saw. Her neck in loose folds, so if she pulled the skin with her fingers, it remained pinched into a peak of skin for long seconds, then slowly softened back to its original sag. The skin itself was pocked like a plucked chicken. She leaned in, tilted her chin to the side. That single dark, bristly whisker had grown back. Insistent little bastard. She moved on, down her neck to the wide, bony rack of her shoulders, from which the rest of her body hung, pale as a fish belly. Things had gone horribly wrong. Her breasts looked as if someone had shoved tangerines into pantyhose. Her nipples faced the floor. Her arms, when she held them out, jiggled, flop-flopped, the muscle like pizza dough. She realized her analogies were to food items and wondered if this was because food rotted. Food was fresh and plump, and then it molded and stank, and bit by bit disintegrated. Her belly rounded and pooched above her pubic mound. Again, food, the muffin top. Her pubic hair was getting sparse. One day it would disappear altogether. What irony that young women, she'd been one once, spent a fortune manicuring this, ripping it out with hot wax, right there alongside the delicate labia. Some women even took off all the hair, so their privates resembled those of a child. What kind of man wants to have sex with a child? What kind of grown-up woman would encourage this? Sex, however, was no business of hers. No one would touch her again, no hands slip across her hips, no kisses upon her cheek. She might live another 40 years with not a single touch other than her own. Her thighs dimpled, pale and lumpy as oatmeal. Clusters of burst veins resembled bruises, so the oatmeal looked mottled, indeed mouldy. More skin gathered in a crease above her knees. Pastry. Her lower legs were a relief. Her calves were still slim, tapering to nice ankles, and her feet had so far evaded the ravages of bunions. Her gran had had those. They had hobbled her and deformed her. She must have been in considerable pain. Rosie now braced herself to turn, to angle herself in the three-way mirror, and there it was, her ass. Not so much like food, but wax, melted, the whole structure drooping down as if subjected to great heat. Her ass was vertical and flat. Her ass connected directly to her thighs and her back, straight up and down. It was no longer an ass. No one would call it an ass. She was missing an entire section of her body. What she now had instead of an ass was basically a toilet seat. Further up her back, around the red marks of her bra, were handfuls of back fat. She could grasp them fully with both hands. Why did she have fat on her back? She was not a fat person. Her shoulders were bony and muscular even. So what was this fat? And why was it not on the other side of her body, filling her breasts where it might look okay? It was all a terrible joke, her boobs migrating to her back, her round ass swapping places with her flat belly. What was the point of a woman her age? She felt sad, but her sad expression wrinkled her forehead, deepened the crease between her eyes, and she appeared even older, even less attractive. Was ugly a word she might use? I am ugly. Slowly she pulled on her underpants, swung her breasts into her bra, slipped into her clothes. A big, puffy, neck-to-knee fake-down parka covered everything, a winter burqa. Clutching a Liz Claiborne blouse, she opened the dressing room door and walked solemnly to the cash register. The woman at the till was at least 100 pounds overweight, and her grey roots were showing through the hard brunette dye. And yet she was wearing lipstick and mascara and jaunty yellow earrings. And yet she was wearing a wedding ring. Someone loved her. Okay, so that's that.
That's great. So are there questions from the audience? You can type them in the chat. And while we're waiting for them, I have a couple for you. One of them is actually it's a good follow-up to the passage you just read, and one reviewer commented on this, and I thought about it a lot, and that was that for a coming-of-age novel, which is how this starts out, it spans much longer time period, and you do get some of her backstory, which is important, but she really starts as a college student and in age, and she goes till she's 54. Was that intentional, or was that just how she developed as you were writing?
So I can't remember now. I just hit menopause, and I've often said that I've never been able to write about a country while I'm still in it. And so I think that hitting menopause, it was like I left the idea of what that woman country was, and I wanted to explore that range of being a young woman and coming through to middle age from this perspective of being in menopause. So initially, I believe I started trying to write with flashbacks, and I've never been a fan of flashbacks. And so I just started writing from the beginning, and I really didn't anticipate going as far forward as we did. And I've often felt like I'm not quite sure if I've managed to get this scope of this person's life, 30, 40 years into this book. And yet Eric assures me that somehow I have, and I actually think that somehow I have managed to do it, but it does seem somewhat unlikely. I have to say, if someone told me, well, we've managed to get this whole woman's life in 300 pages, I would be suspicious. So I'm not quite sure how I did it, and I can't really answer that question any more than that, Eliza, because I can't remember.
That's good. Well, it is an unusual span, and it may be because you jumped, you let the reader fill in places. That for instance, one of the things I noticed was that when Rosie got pregnant, then there was the aborted abortion scene, and then you jumped, which was so that we got to fill in a period of time by what happened where you jumped to. So I think it was an interesting timeline in the whole book.
One of the problems with that construction was, of course, that picking her up, it had to feel authentic. Like you didn't feel as the reader that you'd miss some big thing, that her life really felt like everything had just sort of progressed along a line that was very recognizable. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite books is old now. It's called The Ginger Tree by Oswald Nguyen, and that actually covers a woman's life. She's a Scottish woman with her husband in China. I think it's sort of turn of last century, and must be very early 20th century, and she has an affair with a Japanese diplomat and gets pregnant by him, and he she goes back and lives in Japan. And that book very beautifully sort of covers a span of 30 years of her life. So I think in the back of my mind, I had that idea. And so many years in our lives go by where really we're just tracking along a path.
That's true. That's true. So, are there questions from the audience? Oh, here we go. So somebody, this is actually a question that somebody asked. They haven't read the book, but Africa figures in the previous books. Is that also true of the hair?
No. That's a good question. So I found that I was struggling to write about Africa in a meaningful way, given that there are so many amazing voices coming out of Africa now, like actual Black African writers. I began to question that as a white person who actually no longer even lived in Africa, what I could add to that. I really wanted to step away from that and set a novel in one place about one person and just see what happened with that.
So when you're writing, you're aware of where you are, and do you know how the story arc is going to happen? And the question that one person had was they've just begun, a couple dozen pages in, but the sense of propulsion in the novel is very strong, and they wanted to know if this is an easy part of writing for you, or if this is something you have to work on. And yeah, basically the writing process of how you carry the book forward. Do you know what's going to happen?
I think every writer has a different process. So I'm very much a rewriter. So I launch myself into something. I kind of have very strong ideas about the character and what I want to happen to the character and where I want the character to go. And I've tried to chart it all out, but it never quite seems to unfold like I think it should. So, but I also write screenplays a lot, and I've found that as a writer of novels, that is an incredibly useful process, because screenwriting has to, you have to propel people through each scene, and each scene can only really be about one emotional arc. You can't have too much going on, otherwise you lose the momentum in the scene. So for me, writing screenplays has been incredibly important, not only in structuring how the action happens and unfolds and the character arcs, but also in writing, like keeping these scenes short and powerful and moving through them and emotionally clear. So that part is the craft. Definitely the craft part has come into how I structure these books.
That's interesting. Are you still writing screenplays?
I am. I'm actually working on a really interesting one that's actually set in Kenya, and I'm working with a fantastic young he's my age, Tanzanian writer, and it's kind of like the True Detective, if anyone's watched that. It's a True Detective set in contemporary Kenya, and we're really enjoying it, and actually things are looking remarkably positive, but we'll see. Who knows? It might be on like Netflix in 2 years or 3 years, and then you can remember me talking about it.
That's exciting. So when you're writing, are you do you have a daily process, a word count? What is your writing process, especially if you're doing novels and screenplays at the same time?
Writing is horrible. It's a really horrible profession. It's isolating. It's incredibly tedious for great long stretches, and it's so much sitting involved that I've actually had to get a special chair, because when I wrote The Gloaming, I actually ended up with hip problems just from sitting so much. So for an active person, the sitting is really difficult. So I'm very disciplined, which I think most writers are. I start at a certain time in the morning and I go to a certain point in the afternoon. And sometimes it's really productive. Sometimes I'll have a great morning and lots of stuff will come. But most of the time you're just sitting there, just tapping away and then deleting what you've read. I have a bed in my office, and sometimes I have to lie down and almost nap because I just can't get anywhere. And that sort of wavery point between being awake and being asleep is this a very meditative place. And sometimes I find I can untangle stuff in that zone. So even though it looks like I'm lying down taking a nap, in fact, I'm working. I think word counts have kind of been meaningless, because if you just write rubbish, you just have to unpick it all the next day. I think really accepting that the rewriting is where the action really happens, is important, and shutting my door. Just my kids can't come in. I unplug from the internet so I don't end up just cruising onto Yahoo or my email for some meaningless, news cycle break, which upsets me anyway. So
True. So somebody asked if you have a mental picture of your reader while you write, and if you worry about impressing or offending anyone while you're writing.
that's a good question. So with this book, I have to be honest, I really wanted to write a woman's book. I wanted women to read this book and connect to it and be like, absolutely, I get this. Like, I wanted every woman to find one sentence in this book where they felt I'd written that sentence for them, that it said something so true. I wanted it to be a communal space for women. I know that sounds weird, and I have to say this, that I started writing this at the very beginning of the Trump the Trump presidency. He had just been elected, and like many women, many people, I was so appalled that this man who had overtly, criticized how women look, and who was known as a groper, who had sexual assault charges, who had said these outrageous things about how you can grab women if you have money and there's no consequences. Like, this man had been rewarded for all of this by being made the president of this country, one of the most powerful positions in the world. And I had to write something that was a riposte to that. This idea of that you can say this kind of thing about women and it's okay. It's not okay. And I wanted Rosie to be the avatar to express that outrage of being subjected to this kind of rubbish that women are all the time and every day in many, many ways. So there we go. So that's my little anger response, but I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, that's good. Are there other questions from the audience? Okay. This is a little question. It's not a big question, but it's one that I was curious about, and that is that you have written dialect for two of the characters, the Vermont, and then the rural Vermont and the upper crust, rich coast Maine. And I was wondering why you chose those two characters to do dialect.
I think that's a really good question, Liza, and it's a tricky one, because you want to be using someone's authentic voice, but you don't want to be caricaturing either. And I think that I get away with it in the Billy character because Billy turns out to be such an amazing character. And I have to say my neighbor has helped me with the elocution of the NEK accent. I would have to call him up and say, like, okay, how do you say cord? And he'd be like, what, card? So So he was very helpful. I probably should have given him, in the acknowledgements, and thanks to my friend Paul for helping me with the Northern Vermont accent. And then the waspy one, maybe it's because I have a British accent and I hear it, the different way people speak. And I always was a huge fan of Tom Wolfe, who I think did such an amazing job with his accents. Of course, he was doing it with quite a lot of satire and a bit of mean-spiritedness. But I always thought that was a real gift of his, to hear how people spoke. And it's not just the accent, but it's the words people use and the phrasing that I think is really important to get right. So I'm not sure that I have, with the Billy character, been completely authentic. I kept hearing like some Yorkshireman in the back of my head, but certainly I think with the waspy character, I'm probably much more on point with that.
Well, actually, when you said you were working on a screenplay, that made sense with that part of your skill set as well, because you can really see these characters in their voices. So somebody asked, we have a little more time. Somebody asked why you chose to make Bennett 20 years older.
That's an interesting question. I wanted somebody who appeared to, well, first of all, when I was young, I had a much older boyfriend. He wasn't 20 years old, but he was 10. And I think that's a substantial age gap. That you don't question somebody who's that much older than you. It's like you think they've had all this life experience. So not anything. So you don't question. So not only is Rosie a naive person, as I think most of us are at 18, even if we think we're not, but she's with this person who seems to have had so much life experience that it's a comfort to her. It's like she's a father that she didn't have, or almost like a parent figure or a mentor. And at first, this is easy for her. She can just surrender to this. And I also wanted somebody who, in himself as a character, had obviously had some kind of life arc before Rosie even came along. I didn't want him to be young. I wanted him to have already reached a point in his life where he was firmly set as a character. And I think 40 is a good age for that. So that's an interesting question, though.
I was reading a book that's actually coming out in April about it's autobiography. It's not fiction, about a young woman who was in Maine, lived rurally, and got involved with an older man who was more educated. And I actually was reading that galley as I was trying to read the galley of your book, and I couldn't do it because I kept getting the stories mixed up. So I had to put that one down because it was that real life relationship and what you were writing it was the same story for those same imbalance reasons, the reasons of imbalance. Somebody asked if there was anything you don't read while you're writing, and I guess my side of that question is what do you read when you're reading for yourself?
So I definitely don't read novels when I'm writing, partly because it's not that I don't want to be influenced. I just want to keep that creative headspace really quite clear. I mean, I just love detective books. I love detective fiction. That shows, I think, a little bit in my books anyway. And I read a lot of nonfiction. So I really lean towards those when I'm writing. And then when I'm not writing, that's when I kind of catch up on fiction. And even then I find I'm really lazy. Like, people have to give me books and say, read this. I don't actively go. I mean, I constantly read the New York Times book review and all these other book reviews, and I pin things up on the wall and I must read this, and then I just never get round to it. So literally I read what people give me. And somewhere on here I saw hope. Bentley, my friend up here. And in fact, she's like my loaner library. She just gives me books and I read them. So thank you, Hope.
Somebody just asked, which is an interesting question, and I'm not using names. I don't know why. I never do. Maybe I should start so I can explore that later. But somebody asked, as your hype woman, does your mom promote something from or about the book that is a surprise to you?
Sorry, what was that? Does my mom?
As your hype woman, as your your band leader, does she take from the book what you would expect, or does what she takes from the book or promotes about the book surprise you because she's reading it from a different perspective?
I have not actually talked very much about this book with her. So in a weird way, that's an incredibly personal question. I think at some point I'd like to talk with her about it. But I did write it with her in mind, because as I said earlier, I wanted, every woman to connect to this. And I know my mom comes from a different generation where that sense of oppression and obligation was even more profound than it was, when I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting watching my daughters, because I didn't get pregnant until my mid-40s. So my daughters are kind of entering the cattle chute of womanhood as I exit it. And it's really interesting to see how much the ground has shifted in terms of their expectations of themselves as women, and the social expectations that are kind of all around them in this sort of miasma. It is a different landscape now than it was when I was a young woman and then my mom was. And at some point I'd like to have that discussion with her.
Okay. So are there other questions or other things that you would like to tell us about the hair that we haven't touched on yet?
I just I guess I would just say, if people feel really strongly about something they've read, that please get in touch and talk to me about it, ask about it. There's a lot in there. I think some of it is probably quite difficult to read.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always curious to see what people think and what people feel and how they react to this, because I do think it is a feminist thriller or a feminist novel, or however you want it. Definitely there's that feminist there's that feminist line in here that runs through it. So
yeah, it's true. Well, I really appreciate this evening. It's been interesting for me. I've learned things about the book, and I had the privilege of already having read it. I'm glad that everybody could join us for tonight, and we actually have events every Thursday night for the next 4 weeks. Very different. We have skiing, we have road trips with teenagers, we have a mystery, and we have the Vermont Almanac. So a very wide range of subjects. You can, Michael's just put up the link to the hair in the chat again. You can also just find it on our website. And Melanie is signing books. We've got to make arrangements actually again, because we've run out of signed books, but we will do that. And we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and join us for future events. And Melanie, please keep us posted on what you're working on next.
I will. Liza, thank you. You've been such a great support there at the Norwich Bookstore, and it is a real shame not to be able to just come in and
soon. Okay, and you were getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, and people can't wait to read it. So this has been really great, and we look forward to the new year and a brighter one for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. It's really, wow, thanks. Thanks. And I hope that the book lives up to your efforts and to this gorgeous, beautiful,
yes,
beautiful cover.
The cover is spectacular. It's great. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Liza.
Yep. We'll be in touch.